All right, cool. Well, thanks again for joining, and welcome to what we call Borrow Better. So, Dr. Rebecca Mears and I think Rebecca's here. I think I saw her join. Do a lot of education for veterinary students, pre-veterinary students, veterinarians on student loans and how best to borrow and repay them. This is the latest installment of what we call Borrow Better, right? So we're going to focus mostly on borrowing, but we'll touch upon some repayment stuff because that's where a lot of the changes are going to take effect, at least for most of you who are not fourth years. So that will make sure that we address those types of things. So what has changed? There's definitely a lot that is changing. When it actually changes and what those changes will look like for you will depend on where you are in the program and what your borrowing status is. So that's going to be something really important to take note of and ask questions about in terms of which changes apply to you and when those are going to take effect. So here's what we'll try to cover over the next hour or so. So, understanding your cost of attendance, hopefully most of you are familiar with that. That's what sets your federal student loan borrowing limit. So your school sets that cost of attendance. Your financial aid awards, knowing what's in there, asking any questions you have about those particular awards, your student loan types and what those interest rates are, knowing how to estimate your graduation balance so you can have a better idea of how to manage repayment and which repayment options are going to work best for you. We'll talk about borrowing mistakes, things that students often make, and I even have an example here to illustrate for someone who is starting their third year. So we can learn a lot from looking at, like we do our clinical cases, we can learn a lot from our fellow student colleagues who are in the act of borrowing and some of the mistakes that they might be making too, which they seem like pretty innocent things to do, or maybe even best practices, but often don't result in the best outcomes. So we'll show you what some of those things look like. And then set the stage for the new repayment landscape, at least those of you that are going to have a set of limited repayment options compared to those of us that are in repayment now. If you have any specific questions or things that you're wondering about your student loans, feel free to throw them in the chat, and I'll make sure to address those as we're working our way through the presentation and the appropriate place there. See some people are jumping in to make sure I don't miss anybody joining. All right, so the secret to student loan repayment, you will pay your balance to zero one way or another. Right, you'll either earn enough to generate a payment that's high enough that'll pay the balance to zero, or you won't and you'll hit forgiveness. Right? Either pathway is fine. Both result in a zero balance. Right? So whether you pay the balance to zero before you hit forgiveness or you hit forgiveness, either is fine. Right? The keys are to keep as much of your student loans in the federal system as possible, because these forgiveness options or the more flexible options only exist for your federal student loans. Borrow as little as possible. Do not make payments to your loans during school. And if you do, we'll talk about a way you can actually return funds that you might not need instead of making payments directly to those loans. Don't pay more than you have to for your student loans after you graduate. Right? So the temptation is to get rid of these things as fast as possible, but oftentimes your income doesn't support that, or you have to start cutting into other more critical areas of your overall financial wellness in order to do that. And that's really not a great idea either. Your federal student loans are the most flexible debt you're ever going to have. Even with all of the uncertainty and crazy changes that have been going on in the background, they are still the most flexible debt you're ever going to have. So we don't want to over-focus on them, right? We want to know how they work and we want to know the best ways to handle them, but we want to make sure that we're also using our resources in the most beneficial way possible. So when you start earning income as a veterinarian, you're going to have the opportunity to do a lot of great things with that income. Right? And while your student loan payment will be one of those things, it shouldn't take over your entire financial plan, right? Because then you're going to be giving up a lot of the other areas that will outgrow the impact that you'll have by making additional payments toward your student loans. So a couple of truisms, I guess, I'd like to throw out there. It's always easier to manage less in repayment than more, right? So that pertains specifically to borrowing. And your federal student loans are still the most flexible, but really annoying debt you're ever going to have. Why do I care about this? I've got a ton of student debt. I'm married to a veterinarian as well. She's got a ton of student debt. We have a lot of experience with this insane repayment system. But one of the reasons why, I kind of do this is because I learned pretty quickly that trying to pay the loans back as fast as possible is really not realistic, at least not in our case where we have what I call a double vet household. Right? For us to be able to do that, we would have had to have paid $4,500 a month towards our student loans, and that was to eliminate the balance in 10 years. Right? And that really wasn't going to make financial sense. In fact, we weren't even earning that much. So there was no way we could actually do that. That's where we stumble upon these income-driven options. And these are, they've been around for a while. They've gone through a series of changes. We've added some, and now we're going to take some away. Over the years, they've changed a lot, right? They've tended to get better rather than worse. And now, unfortunately, we're kind of in a period where we're seeing them get worse instead of get better. So the pendulum swings both directions. It's just a matter of how long that arc lasts in either of those directions. But we started initially with what was called income-based repayment, or IBR. And there's two versions of that. There's an older version, which we're eligible for, and there's a newer version, which I imagine at least one of you, the one that's a graduating fourth year, will be eligible for. But then the rest of you are going to probably lose access to IBR altogether. Right. So as the name implies, the payments are based on your income. So income-based repayment. So that we had a payment that was $1,400 a month instead of $4,500 a month. And that was a lot more manageable. Right. And then we had a new plan come online that was called Revised Pay As You Earn. That calculated our payment down even lower. So we switched to that version. Then we had the pandemic, and they turned off payments, they turned off interest, but they still gave us credit towards forgiveness. The way these income-driven plans work is you make payments based on your income for a certain number of years, and if you still have a balance remaining at the end, that balance is forgiven. But that forgiven balance can also be treated as taxable income. Right? So that's how these student loan repayment options work for your federal student loans. They can be very beneficial, right? Because as opposed to pegging the payment to your balance, which in our case would have been $4,500 a month, you can have a payment that reflects your income, which in most cases, for most veterinarians who have a six-figure student loan balance, that payment based on your income will be much more manageable than trying to pay it off in some specified period of time. So we came out of the pandemic forbearance. We had a different repayment option available called SAVE, Saving on a Valuable Education. That was actually an update of Revised Pay As You Earn. The courts got involved. SAVE was deemed to be not legal, so they put that on hold, and everybody that was using SAVE, including myself and my wife, were put into a forbearance. That forbearance period has been lasting a little bit longer than a year, and they turned the interest rate off, but no forgiveness credit was granted for that forbearance time. But then just recently, 2 weeks ago, August 1st, they turned the interest back on for those of us in the SAVE forbearance. So those of us in repayment are struggling with, well, what do we do? Do we move on? Do we switch options? Unfortunately, what's old is new again for us. We're probably going to end up back in the original version of IBR. And if not, there's a new version that just got included in the recent tax and spending legislation called the Repayment Assistance Plan. And that's going to be the one that most of you are going to have the option of using once you graduate. So I mentioned that for us, we're making payments based on our income. It's quite likely that we're going to reach forgiveness, given how many years we've been in repayment already and how much of a balance we have remaining. So we're planning and saving for that potential tax that we'll have to pay on the amount that's forgiven. And we've met what my guesstimate is for our anticipated tax, and we have about 12 years to go before we actually reach forgiveness. So I've got quite a bit of flexibility there to adjust that tax fund if I need to. And, if my payments end up being more, I'll probably have less forgiven. So I can pull from that forgiveness fund to make some of those payments that might be higher than they would have been under the more beneficial plans that are now, unfortunately, no longer available. So that's a lot, right? That's just in a nutshell, kind of what repayment looks like for me, for my wife, for many veterinarians out there. If you need help with any of this stuff, we have a special student debt message board area. I'll show you what that looks like. Some of you maybe have seen that with the time you've spent as VIN-terns this summer. So kind of like any of the other message boards on VIN, we help each other out with complex cases, and your student loans are no different. You do have the ability to post anonymously in the student debt message board areas. It's one of the only places on VIN where you're able to do that. And that's because of all the sensitive personal financial information that we're also asking you to contribute, so we can help you through a lot of these questions that commonly come up when it comes to student loan repayment. You'll always have access to that student debt message board area, whether you are a paying VIN member after graduation or not. So the VIN Foundation offers you a way to access your student debt message board area. So, again, even if you're no longer a VIN member, you still can review those message board discussions and post new questions to get help with your student loans into the future. All right, so why should you care now? Your cake isn't baked yet. For some of you, it's really close, right? I mean, especially graduating this year. That cake is largely baked. And if you don't have to take any student loans, as you mentioned before I started, then you know what your balance is. Right now, there is still interest accruing on those student loans, right? So we'll have to make sure we account for that. And you can use the tools I'll show you that live on VIN Foundation to put a bow on what that final balance will look like for you. But it's expensive to take all the loans that are offered, right? And that's the easiest thing to do, is to look at your financial aid award, check the box that says I'm just going to take it all and I'll worry about it later, right? And yeah, that's one way to do it. And it's not terrible if you end up doing that, but again, it's always easier to manage less than it is to manage more. So if you do take a few minutes to review what you're being offered, how much do you actually need, take some time during the semester to check in on those numbers, you might be able to return a good chunk of those funds and have less to manage when you graduate, and have less interest that accrues while you're in school as well. So the student loan physical exam is how we approach this. Just like with any complex case, the first thing you do is a good physical exam. So we're going to do that with our student loans. So your federal student loans, most of you are going to be seeing direct unsubsidized loans, direct grad plus loans. If you have loans from undergrad, they may be subsidized, which means that the interest does not accrue while you're in school. But unfortunately, there's not really subsidized loans for veterinary school unless you're lucky enough to get these health profession student loans or loans for disadvantaged students. Those are the only source of non-interest bearing loans while you're in school for veterinary school. Some of you might find some older Perkins loans. I still see some of those floating around, but those are no longer available. Even with all the changes, you can still get federal student loans. So we'll talk about what that looks like, just in case you happen to fall into a scenario that might change that. But I don't anticipate that's going to be the case for any of you that are here this afternoon. But we can talk about some of those anyway. You can look for the details of your federal student loans on the studentaid.gov website. So studentaid.gov, you can log in and see your student loan details. So a lot going on the studentaid.gov website because they're changing lots of things. I'll log in here really quick. Let's see if they send me code. And I'll encourage you to do this while we're here presenting, right? I mean, this is a great way to start playing with your own student loan data, right? So you can see my portion of the household student loan balance. I can see my loan servicer, right? But this isn't enough information for me to really know what to do. So I'm going to hit this view details button. And it'll take me to this next dashboard area. And I'm looking for this download my aid data button, right? So this is where you'll get your federal student aid data file. So lots of scary language, continue, and it'll let you save this as a text file on your computer, right? So that's what we're looking for, is that TXT file. And I'll show you an example of one in just a second here. So once you have that studentaid.gov file, and that's where you're going to head over to the My Student Loans tool, and then eventually the in-school loan estimator, and then potentially the loan repayment simulator once you get familiar and ready to start looking at what repayment might look like. So let's head over to the My Student Loans tool. So VIN Foundation Student Debt Center, publicly available. Anybody can use this. Everybody does use this, right? But it's designed specifically for veterinarians and veterinary students. So those of you that are still borrowing, you'll want to click on this upload my aid data button in the middle here, because you're likely still borrowing. If you're done borrowing, then you can use this one on the end, right? But even I'm sorry, I don't remember who exactly said that they were graduating. You will still want to use this middle box, right? Because it'll give you a link to the in-school loan estimator, and then you can put your graduation date in there, and it'll calculate out how much interest you have remaining to accrue until you get done with school. So even if you're done borrowing, I'd still recommend that you upload your current file using this middle box. So I'm going to upload this here, and I'm going to go to one of the files I prepared here. So this is a student who's starting their third year and has $145,000 so far. All right, so here's the link to the in-school loan estimator up here. I'll show you what that looks like in just a second. But just to go through what we're looking at, right, I can see how much I've borrowed so far. I can see there's a difference between the amount I received and what my current principal is, which suggests that this person's been making payments. I can see that they have made payments, right? So I'm going to expand these details here, look at some of these different values. These are the loans from veterinary school, right? So veterinary school commonly has a $40,500 limit for direct unsubsidized loans, right? And then anything you need above and beyond that would fall into a Grad Plus category. So if I see the loan types here, I've got a number of direct unsubsidized loans. I've got a couple of Grad Plus loans, right? And I've got some subsidized loans that they look like they've already been paid off. Right, so I can see that these are loans from undergrad that this particular student had already paid to zero prior to borrowing their veterinary school loans. I can see that there was some payments made to these particular loans. And this is one of the areas I get a chance here to kind of illustrate this as a mistake, right? So if I hover over this, I can see when they made that payment, right? Which was January of 2024 for these loans that were taken in 2023. But this $10,000 payment is not $10,000 less than the amount they received, right? So this $10,000 payment actually had about a $9,500 impact. And that's because they made that payment or returned funds that they didn't need outside of the 120-day return window, which means a chunk of that payment went towards interest as opposed to directly towards the principal. And this is probably one of the more important concepts of the entire Borrow Better framework here, is that you have 120 days from the time you receive funds, right? And most of you receive your funds in the fall, and then you receive another set again in the spring. And each one of those times you receive those funds, you have a separate 120-day window, right? So 120 days, let's say you receive your funds for your fall semester today. You have 120 days from today to return those funds. And if you execute that return, or in this case, make a payment during that 120-day period, this entire amount will get applied to the principal for the balance that you borrowed for that semester. right? So if you want this amount to have the biggest impact, then you want to make sure it gets applied to those loans that you received in that 120-day window, and it'll return the interest and the fees that are associated with it as well. Right? So it'll have a much bigger impact if you do that than by simply taking the $10,000 and applying it across the entire balance, which then will oftentimes go towards the interest before it hits the principal. And this is a perfect example of that, right? So if this person had returned this $10,000 within that 120-day period, I would expect this balance to be $29,242, right? And in this case, I expect it to be $21,575, right? But there was about $1,000 that went towards interest in both of these attempts to reduce their principal. So not the end of the world, right? But if you want to have less, you want those payments to go further, then that's one trick to do it. Some of the other things that are in here that are worth mentioning, you can see who your loan servicer is. This is an important tab as you're getting closer to repayment, is your IDR eligibility. Now, this is going to change a little bit. Now, the student here that's a fourth year, this will still largely apply for you, right? But anybody who's going to take a loan after July 1st of 2026, this is going to look a lot different, right? And we don't have repayment assistance plan in here yet, but we will soon. You'll only have the repayment assistance plan available to you if you receive a loan after July 1st of 2026. All right, so let's send this over to the in-school loan estimator, right? So I've got 145,000 so far. I'm going to take a peek and see. I've been roughly borrowing 71,000, 79,000. So let's call it 75,000 per year in this particular case. So I'm going to send this over to the in-school loan estimator. It's going to populate the data that it can find. It'll bring over the information that was in the My Student Loans tool. And this is to help us calculate the remaining interest on the funds that you have already borrowed. But then we have to guess how much are we going to borrow for the next year 3 and year 4. We've been borrowing, we're guesstimating here about 75,000. And interest rates for the 2026-2027 year are tracking about the same as they are right now, but we'll have to wait several months before they actually kick in. So if this particular person borrows what they've been borrowing the first two years, right? Now, if they actually reduce their amount by 10,000, they seem to be making consistently a payment of $10,000 each year. We can test that too and see how much our balance will be at graduation. And the reason why this is so important, right, not to torture you with the numbers, is just to make you aware that, you know, we're borrowing a lot of money to get through veterinary school. And the more you borrow, the more interest accrues. Right? And that interest number can be equal to or greater than another year's worth of tuition. Right? So this is, again, why it's so important, if you can, to reduce the amounts that you borrow to only what you need. Right? Because every amount that you don't borrow is an amount that doesn't accrue interest, and this number will be smaller. Right? So if we go back here, and again, if let's say they don't return that 75,000, I'm sorry, that 10,000 each year, right? You know, that's another $2,500 of interest that was added on top of the $20,000 extra that we borrowed. So our balance is obviously higher. So it's easier to manage less than it is to manage more, right? So any little bit that you can do to try and knock some of that off will help. All right, so what has changed? So if you're already enrolled and borrowing, then there won't be any changes to what you've experienced as your student loan options to date, right? There won't be any limits on what you can borrow. You'll still have the direct Grad Plus loans that hit that 40,500 limit, and then I'm sorry, direct unsubsidized loans, and then direct Grad Plus will follow anything you need above that. as long as you're completing your program by 2029. Right. So after that, or for students who are starting their program next fall, they'll be subject to a whole different set of rules. The biggest change that's going to affect most of you, right, unless you're graduating this year or you figure out a way to not take any more student loans after July 1st of 2026, anybody who does receive a loan after July 1st of 2026 will be limited to using the repayment assistance program, that new income-driven plan I mentioned earlier, and a standard plan that has a time frame that's based on the amount that you borrowed and can have a maximum up to 25 years. So for most veterinarians, that will be a 25-year plan, right? I forget what the amount is, but I think it's over 30,000 or maybe over 60,000. And then that will put you at the maximum 25-year standard time frame. Otherwise, you make payments based on your income, and it's a changing percentage based on what your income is, between 1% and 10% of your income. The repayment assistance program has a 30-year time frame until you reach forgiveness. So that's the longest time frame we've seen to reach forgiveness compared to any of the other income-driven plans that we've seen before. So when I was kind of mentioning the pendulum swings both ways, and we happen to be in a period right now where we've got less beneficial options versus more beneficial, this is one of the things that makes it less beneficial, is the fact that it's going to take 30 years to get to forgiveness under the repayment assistance program. The longer it takes to get to forgiveness, generally the more you're going to pay. So what is this not, I mean, some big questions that are still kind of out there. You know, what happens if you take a year off, right? I mean, that happens not infrequently. You know, you may run up against getting some of your loans under the current borrowing limits, and then maybe when you come back, you're going to be subject to some of the new rules. The dual degree program, so I did a combined MBA DBM, so I had a 5-year program. This transition phase doesn't really do 5-year programs very well, right? So that kind of remains to be seen how that's going to be handled for those that are starting those programs maybe this fall, to still have access to those current borrowing limits. I'm not really sure what's going to happen with foreign accredited programs just yet. And then I'm not, you know, there's probably some other scenarios that we haven't really thought of just yet, but there's a lot of questions yet to be answered. But most of them, you know, aren't going to get too confusing for another year yet. Right? So everybody here, as long as you're still borrowing and have less than, you know, 4 years until you graduate, you will not really see any changes except for when you get to graduation and select a repayment plan. You're going to have a limited set of repayment options. One of the things I mentioned, you know, we were bantering a little bit before we started, was in order to make sure that you're eligible for the current borrowing limits, you have to be enrolled in a program and borrowing, right? So if you're not borrowing or haven't used loans yet, then you may want to take a loan before July 1st of 2026. So you check both of those boxes to be able to have access to the current loan structure before you fall under the new one. Now, some schools have been telling people to take everything or that they're offered, or maybe even borrow loans above what they need, or grab a grad plus loan just in case. And that sounds a little extreme to me. You know, taking a little bit makes a little sense to me, just to make sure that you have a loan before July 1st of 2026 and you meet those requirements to be eligible for the existing borrowing rules versus the new ones that take effect next year. But you don't have to go crazy with it, right? We don't need to take thousands of dollars more than we might need, but maybe a little bit just to make sure we check the box might make sense. So it really depends on your circumstances. I mean, this would be a great thing to post on the message boards if you have some questions about borrowing and whether or not you would be subject to the current borrowing rules or the new ones that are going to take effect after July 1st of 2026, mostly for people who have not yet taken a loan. All right. Well, any questions so far?
I do have kind of a like wonky like hypothetical question.
Sure.
Um, so I'm a third year student, and I have taken out my loans for this year. If I did not take out loans for my final year, and so did not borrow after that July 2026 kind of deadline, would I, like upon graduation, would I have access to a greater number of like income-based repayment options?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and yes, you should. If as long as you don't have a loan after July 1st of 2026, you would have access, most likely. I haven't seen your borrowing history, but most likely you would have access to the new version of IBR, which is, the best option you can possibly have. Right. So this IBR 2014. So if you upload your student aid file into the My Student Loans tool and you check the IDR eligibility tab, you'll see if you're otherwise eligible for IBR 2014. Now we're going to work this algorithm into here when we add the repayment assistance plan in here. But anybody that has a loan after July 1st of 2026 will no longer be eligible for this option. Right. But
Got it. Thank you.
yeah, so if you were able to do that, more power to you, and that would put you in a better position in terms of having a more flexible repayment option. Now, you also have to be very careful that you don't consolidate your loans when you enter repayment, because even a consolidation after July 1st of 2026 would then make you ineligible for any of the prior income-driven repayment options.
Oh, I thought that, and I probably just had this completely wrong. I thought that consolidation was a requirement to enter into an income-driven repayment program.
It is not. Thanks for asking,
Okay.
because that is not the case, right? So the requirement is that it's a direct loan, right? And there's multiple different types of direct loans. A direct consolidation loan is just one type of direct loan. Now, consolidations can be helpful to take health profession student loans, loans for disadvantaged students, Perkins loans, and make them eligible for these income-driven plans, right? Because only these direct loans are eligible for these income-driven plans, right? So consolidation can take those non-direct loans and make them direct loans, right? So that's the benefit of consolidating, or at least it had been in the past. But now during this transition period, you have to be very careful about consolidating, right? And particularly if your goal is to, maybe be able to use this older, or what will be an older version of IBR 2014, then you don't want to consolidate. Right? Because anybody who consolidates after July 1st of 2026, the system will see that you have a new loan after July 1st of 2026, and it makes you ineligible for any of the prior plans. So you can still use them without consolidating, at least for the direct loans.
Got it.
Yep. Excellent. So I'm going to focus mostly on borrowing stuff here, but please feel free to ask any other questions too, especially things like that you've heard that we might be able to, demystify, if you will, before you get too far down the road, right? Because there's not a lot of opportunity to kind of undo things, right? Consolidation is impossible to undo, right? So that's going to be something we'll have to focus on a lot in the coming year, because for years and years we've been talking about consolidation as one of the better ways to enter repayment, and all of a sudden it's now not a great idea if you can get by without doing it. So you have to be very, very careful with consolidation going forward. All right, so stuff I've already said before. If you have loans from before vet school, leave them alone, right? This is another one of those common mistakes I see a lot of veterinary students make, is maybe because they're undergrad balances are smaller and they have smaller interest rates. If they have a little bit extra money, they are throwing money at those undergraduate loans to get rid of them. All the while they're borrowing more expensive veterinary school loans. Right. So if you have undergrad loans, leave them alone. Right. If you have extra money, borrow less for veterinary school. That will go farther. Or return funds during that 120-day window. What makes your federal student loans so flexible? I've said that a million times. They have more favorable repayment terms versus private loans. You can consolidate them, as we just kind of talked about, especially those non-direct loans. And this is particularly one of the only, well, not only, but one of the beneficial reasons to consolidate in the future will be to take something like health profession student loans and make them eligible for income-driven plans and public service loan forgiveness, if that's on the table for you. But again, it's going to have to be done a little bit more carefully than we've done in the past. So it'll be more on a case-by-case basis, but having that option still is more flexible than not. Even though you only have or may only have access to this new repayment assistance program, it's still better than any private loan that doesn't care what your income is. Right? Private loans only have repayment options that are based on the balance and the interest rate and the amount of time that you take to pay it back. Right? The federal loans are the only ones that will allow you to use your income as a factor in that repayment. And that is hugely beneficial. It's hard to overstate how beneficial that can be. Just based on the variations in your career path, internships, residencies, maybe, take some time off to start a family or moving jobs, whatever you're doing as you work your way through your veterinary career, oftentimes has some ups and downs with your income, right? That doesn't work very well with private loans or repayment plans that have a fixed monthly payment, no matter what your income is. And that's why those income-driven plans are so helpful. Public service loan forgiveness is still available, right? So if your career is going to take you into academia, or maybe, you're going to work for a shelter, a zoo, aquarium, as long as it's a 501c3 nonprofit, the payments that you make toward your student loans can be eligible for public service loan forgiveness. You will have to use an income-driven plan to make those payments, but public service loan forgiveness is one of the quickest and least expensive ways to eliminate your student loans. So after making payments for 10 years using an income-driven plan, if you have a balance remaining, that balance is forgiven tax-free. So you don't have to pay tax on the forgiveness under public service loan forgiveness. And because it happens after 10 years of those qualifying payments, it is one of the fastest and least expensive ways to eliminate your student loan balance. Your federal student loans generally have more favorable deferment and discharge provisions if something terrible should happen, and they're never anybody else's responsibility, right? So private loans often have cosigners, particularly if you borrowed them as a student or you're trying to refinance with a private loan after graduation and you don't have a very robust credit history yet. Most times they're going to require a cosigner. So your federal student loans are never anybody else's responsibility, which also means if something terrible should happen to you, your student loans go away with you. So that's not something that's always the case with non-federal student loans. Let me kind of just go through some of these pretty quickly. Scholarships and grants are great if you can get them. There's not a huge pot of money available for that. Some schools are much better about it than others, but grants you don't have to pay back. So that's great. Family support. This is a little different now. Generally, we recommend if your family wants to help you pay for veterinary school, doing so earlier in the program rather than later is the best way to do it. And that's because those loans that you take earlier in the program are going to accrue interest for the longest time, right? So those are the most expensive loans. If you can have them contribute in the front end versus the back end, right, that will have a bigger impact. It'll result in a lower amount of student loan balance that you'll have to manage for repayment. You have to be a little bit careful with this now, because you do, if you want to maintain access to the current borrowing limits, you have to at least have a loan before July 1st of 2026, right? So a little bit of a balance there, right? So if you don't, if your family wants to help, let them help apply most of those funds towards the front end, but you probably still want to have a little bit of a balance on a student loan before July 1st of 2026, so you can maintain access to those current borrowing limits and not be subject to the future ones, which are going to be have a lower cap on the current borrowing limits do. This still applies, right? Personal funds or spouse funds, don't mortgage your family's financial future just to avoid student loans, right? Student loans are still the most flexible debt you're ever going to have, right? So an appropriate amount is a good use of borrowing, right? And it helps to maintain some of that other financial wellness status for your family, for your spouse that might be trying to help. We don't want you sacrificing those critical financial wellness items to overpay on your student loans. It doesn't make sense for anybody else to do the same. Right. So I know they mean well, right? But it would be better if they were maximizing their overall financial wellness than trying to, cut out those particular elements just to reduce the amount of student loans that you have. Private loans, avoid them if possible, right? Especially for veterinary school, they're unnecessary. Now they're going to be necessary in most cases for folks who are starting school next year, right? But thankfully, you all are generally grandfathered into the current borrowing rules as long as you are enrolled in borrowing before July 1st of 2026. Right? So you shouldn't need private loans. Right? Private loans are not eligible for income-driven plans. They're not eligible for public service loan forgiveness. There's no way to get a private loan into the federal system. Right? So they're less flexible. And if you have both private loans and federal student loans, it's going to be much more difficult to manage all of that after graduating. So that's going to be a new challenge for future veterinary students. Most of them are going to have a combination of federal and private loans, and it's going to make repayment even more complicated than it already was. So be thankful that you have access to the existing borrowing rules and limits, even though your repayment options are going to be somewhat limited. All right, I've already given you the answer to this. Who knows what their interest rates are for this coming academic year for your direct unsubsidized loans? You can type it in the chat too if you want. I ask because most students way overestimate what their federal student loan interest rate is. 7.94. Thank you, Claire. Yes, 7.94 is the direct unsubsidized limit. And then the Grad Plus loan always has a percentage point higher interest rate, or 1 point higher, so 8.94%. And that's for this academic year. Following academic years will depend on what the 10-year treasury is around May, June. But right now it's kind of tracking around the same level. So we'll have to wait and see what that looks like for the 2026-2027 academic year. These health profession student loans, if your school offers them, they are some of the best loans that you can get because they don't accrue interest. And when you're in repayment, they have a 5% interest rate. So first step, go to your financial aid office and ask them if they offer health profession student loans. And second step is, what do I need to do to apply? Right now, they will require you to provide your family's financial information in most cases, but don't let that deter you from doing it. Even if you think that maybe your parents make too much money for you to be eligible, it's kind of relative, right? They're going to put you into a bucket that compares you against everybody else who's applied for them and then determine how much you're eligible for. So you may be surprised to find out that you can receive these no matter what your circumstances are. So if your school offers them, there's no reason not to try to apply for them. Any amount that you can get in health profession student loans can help you reduce the amount that you take in these higher interest rate loans. And because you can consolidate these, right, you can still make them eligible for these income-driven plans after graduation, right? So I would encourage everybody here to ask about those and apply for them if your school offers them. Not every school does, but most of the state schools do, and even a couple of the private schools do. If you borrowed more than you needed, or you find that you want to make payments towards your student loans during school, use that 120-day return window, because they'll apply if any, and you might have to go to your financial aid office or call your loan servicer while you're going to do that, but you want to make sure that the amount that you're returning, right, corresponds to the amount that you borrowed that's within that 120-day window. If you just go on your loan servicer's website and try to make a payment, it's going to get proportionally applied to all of your remaining loan balance, right? So that won't assure that that payment gets applied to those loans that you received in that 120-day window. So if you're going to do that, make sure you ask some questions before, so it has the impact that you're trying to get, which is to reduce the principal dollar for dollar using the amount that you return in a 120-day window. I've already given you the answer to this too. So which loans will cost you the most? And those are those loans that you took out, in first year. So because they're going to have the most time to accrue interest. Cost of attendance sets those borrowing limits. Here's an example of what that looks like, right? So I'm just going to pick on UC Davis. This is what their cost of attendance is in the first and second year for 2025, 2026. UC Davis is one of those great schools that allows you to change your residency status after the first year. So even if you're not a California resident, by the time you get to second year, nearly everybody is paying that in-state rate. So nobody can borrow any more than $73,842. Your student aid index, right? This is what's determined after you fill out your FAFSA application. In the overwhelming majority of cases, because you're considered to be independent from your parents when you get to professional school, your index is normally zero, unless you're married, right? Or you're coming to veterinary school as a second career change, and you've got some assets on your balance sheet. You may have an index that's greater than zero, right? So which means you may not qualify for the entire cost of attendance, but that's pretty rare, right? So most veterinary students are eligible for the entire cost of attendance. UC Davis also has an excellent grant program. Nearly every tuition paying student attending UC Davis receives a grant of around $7,000, somewhere between $7,000 and $8,000. So after that gets subtracted, same thing would happen if you received a scholarship. They would subtract that amount off the amount that you need. So here with $66,842 is now the maximum amount that we can take in student loans. That's going to get fulfilled first by direct unsubsidized loans up to $40,500, and anything we need above and beyond that will then fall in the Grad Plus category. All right, so this should be pretty familiar to you in terms of what your financial aid award looks like. What's changing for folks that are going to start next year, right, is you're only going to have direct unsubsidized loans up to a maximum of $50,000, and Grad Plus loans will no longer be available. Right, so if you play that out here, right, if I needed $66,842 and I got $50,000 in direct unsubsidized loans, that would leave me $16,842 short to cover the remaining cost of attendance. I would have to seek out those funds elsewhere, which most likely means a private student loan. So $16,000 per year, $17,000 per year in private student loans I would need, even paying resident tuition at UC Davis. Right, so that's what borrowing is going to look like in the future. For you all that are still under these current rules, right? So then half of this you're going to receive this semester, the other half you'll receive in the spring semester, right? That's what triggers that 120-day clock, right? So if you're going to return an amount that you receive, right, first return the Grad Plus loans if you receive those, and focus on the balance that you received in the most recent 120-day period. All right, so what happens if I borrow too much, right? Look at your or before we even get to that, let's talk about what can you do to help make this work, right? And if I were, hindsight's 2020, if I could go back and redo how I borrowed for veterinary school, this is what I would do, right? I would open a savings account, right? Most of you probably already have some kind of spending account or checking account. You can use bankrate.com and see, what is the most beneficial online high yield savings account I can find, right? So I can see that there's some here that are at 3.5, 3.8, 3.65, right? So any of these will be fine, right? But you want to start an online savings account. And when you get your loan amount, right? So what usually happens, and you guys have experienced this, right? You get your financial aid award, a good chunk of it goes to the school to cover your tuition, and whatever's remaining gets deposited in your spending account for you to cover your living expenses. So take that living expense refund, the amount that you received to cover those living expenses for the entire semester, and put it in that savings account with that high yield interest rate. Using your budget, figure out how much you need each month to cover your bills, and then transfer that amount back into your spending account to cover those expenses. Right? If you have this sort of barrier between your spending account and your savings account, you're less likely to burn through all of your living expenses, and you'll have a better idea of how much you might be able to return before you hit that 120-day window. Right? So you can check in, 120 days from now it's after Thanksgiving break. So before Thanksgiving break, you can check your savings account. How much do you have in there? How much have you been spending monthly, right? If there's a pretty significant difference, then maybe you can afford to return, $1,000, $2,000, $4,000 of your living expenses to reduce the amount of interest that'll accrue during school and reduce the amount that you have to manage when you get to repayment. It's okay to allocate a certain amount of your student loans for an emergency fund, right? Emergencies happen while we're in school too. Right? You don't want to put those expenses on a credit card. Credit cards have interest rates north of 20%. Right? Your federal student loans are still the most flexible debt you're ever going to have. It's okay to keep $1,000 in that savings account for emergency fund, even if you're accruing 7.94% on it, right? It's better than putting it on a credit card. If you have credit card debt, consider eliminating it, right? And if you have a really good budget, and maybe it was a one-time thing that you had to use a credit card and things got out of hand, you can use your student loans to help you eliminate that, right? But don't use the student loans just so you can keep racking up the credit card debt. So you have to be really careful about that. But that is an opportunity to help you eliminate that less flexible credit card debt with more flexible student loans. So the way that the cost of attendance estimate works, right? So this is, an example. Every school is going to be a little bit different, but this is how they come up with the estimate to offer you for student loans, right? So in this case, they call it indirect cost, the cost that you don't actually pay directly to the university. This is the amount that you might be offered to cover your living expenses. If your budget shows something less than that, that's an opportunity for you to borrow less, right? Or return funds during that 120-day window. So the 120-day window, think of it as a trial and error period, right? You may not know exactly how much you need now, and that's fine. Most students don't, right? So they take what's offered to them, but you do have that 120 days to figure it out, right? That's a long time. So if you realize that you don't need as much as you have, then return it, right? So if you figure out, in this case, $29,830 comes out to about $2,500 a month in expenses. If your budget shows you have less than $2,500 a month of expenses, then you probably have an amount that you can return before that 120-day period expires. All right, so I borrowed more than I needed. What can you do with that? Pay off credit card debt if you can. Use it to start an emergency fund. If you have private loans for any reason, maybe you can use it as an opportunity to reduce those private loans and replace them with those federal student loans. But consider using that 120-day return window to your advantage. If you're coming up short, make sure that you've been offered all of the loans that you're eligible for. Right? So the Grad Plus loans, if you're not aware, require a separate application. So you fill out FAFSA, that's what kind of gives you the direct unsubsidized loan. That if you need above and beyond that, the Grad Plus application is an additional application, right? So there is a separate application for those Grad Plus loans. If you're still falling short, well, that's where we need to really evaluate our budget, right? Can we pare down our expenses? Are there things that we can do to reduce some of our larger expense items and potentially come in under those cost of attendance estimates? For borrowing mistakes, these are some of the things that I see most students kind of tripping up on, right? So using loans other than federal student loans to pay for veterinary school, paying the interest on student loans during school, that's another common occurrence. Your loan servicer will actually encourage you to do that. And it's just bad advice, right? If you're going to do something, return funds during that 120-day window. Cashing out retirement funds, or your family cashing out retirement funds to help you pay for veterinary school, that's not a great use of those funds. Those retirement funds are tax advantaged. They compound growth in your favor, in your family's favor. Your student loans do not, right? They do not compound. The interest does not compound. They do not cost you more than those retirement funds are earning you in return. So they're not a great use of that type of investment to reduce your student loans. Don't use your vet school loans to pay off undergrad loans. It really helps if you have a budget. I know it's a pain in the butt to budget, but it really, you can't manage what you don't measure, right? And a budget really helps you manage your finances. The earlier you start that and get that ingrained into your habits, the better you're going to do financially. Borrowing more than your budget and needs. You're gonna hear a lot of weird things, particularly in the next year and a half, until we get accustomed to whatever this new normal is. So anything that you hear, ask, right? And I'll take you over to the message boards in a second just to show you what that looks like. But please post those questions, right? So but before you take loans that you otherwise wouldn't have taken just because somebody thinks that you need to do that to receive loans the following year, right? So just be careful, right? These transition periods are always rife with misinformation, right? And things that may not be, best practices. All right. What other questions do you all have about student loans or borrowing? Oh, let me show you the student debt message board area. So actually, let me go back to, so if you're on the student debt center, right, it's going to ask you to log in if you're not already logged in. Here it knows I'm logged in, right? If you're logged in, you'll see a link to the student debt message board area. And if you have a discussion in the student debt message board area, it will show you this little icon and take you directly to your particular student debt discussion. So this will take me to the most recent discussion that I think I posted to. Let's see, yeah. So so this is what they look like, right? So when you get to repayment, we often ask veterinarians to fill out what we call a student debt and income signalement form, right? And it asks a handful of questions to provide enough information for us to do a comprehensive analysis of their student loans and answer the questions that they have, right? So this is a person who's graduated 2012 from Washington State University that's doing shelter practice. Here's their remaining student loan balance. They were using the SAVE plan, right? They're looking at switching maybe back to pay as you earn, right? Because earlier I was talking about how SAVE is kind of eliminated, kind of in a weird limbo, and people are accruing interest, or everybody's looking for what they should do next. Here's their income. We have to, and this is what I was talking about a lot, all of these specifics matter, right? Are you married? How do you file your taxes? What does your spouse earn? What's your family size, right? So all of these play a role in how the federal repayment system calculates your repayment amount if you're using an income-driven plan. And because these income-driven plans are so beneficial, right? And in this case, this person is working towards public service loan forgiveness, so they have to use an income-driven plan, right? All of these things matter, right? They probably shouldn't, but they do, right? This is the world we live in when it comes to financing your education, because most of us are dealing with that six-figure debt. It behooves us to know what those options are and how they work. So this, and then they'll kind of post some other specifics about their situation, their questions, what they're hoping to accomplish, and then we'll go through and do our physical exam, make some recommendations based on what we find, and then help them document what they're doing. So when you're trying to earn public service loan forgiveness, we want to make sure that you have the adequate amount of time logged so you can hit forgiveness as soon as you are eligible for it. And oftentimes it can be challenging to get the system to reflect how much eligible time you have. And you have to, they make you work for this stuff, right? I mean, I wish it was a lot easier, but unfortunately it's a lot more complicated than it probably needs to be in many cases. So, that's why we do this, right? So we're here to help guide you along the way when these questions come up, right? And they will. I mean, every time you have you take a new job, you have a big life event like getting married or having kids or changing jobs or whatever the case is, right? All of these things are going to kind of come up and present themselves. And here's where you can go to investigate some other colleagues' scenarios, or you can post your own. And you're able to just keep this discussion going for as long as need be. I mean, there's thousands of these in here, right? So some of them have very robust conversations going back and forth. This one's got 45 different posts, right? So there's, and most of them are from that individual, right? So there's a lot of back and forth that goes on with these discussions to help guide you through that repayment strategy. Any other questions that you all have? Maybe anything? Go ahead.
I have a couple questions about repayment stuff, which is more relevant for like fourth year people. And I know there's not as many fourth years on this call. So if there's other people that have questions, they can go first.
Yeah, but feel free to ask your questions. I think they'll learn from the questions you're going to ask, but we will do, I mean, we're going to be doing what we call, so this is borrow better, right? Focus more on the borrowing aspect. We do ones that we call repay wiser, and particularly ones that are geared towards new grads. We do a new grad student loan playbook, but that'll be coming shortly too. So mostly we do that in the spring semester. So we'll focus more on the repayment and preparing for repayment things, but feel free to ask any questions you have about repayment.
So since I already took like my last set of loans and I don't plan on taking any in the spring either, is now a good time if I have a supplemental job where I'm having income and I'm married, so I have a spouse that also has an income where we have extra money that we can put at the loans? Is this a good time for us to start paying on it, or is it not helpful?
Yeah, I generally, no, I wouldn't. I mean, and so it kind of comes back to the idea that your federal student loans are the most flexible debt you're ever going to have. If you want to jumpstart something, jumpstart other areas of your financial wellness, right? If you have a job, then you can contribute to a retirement account, right? The tax advantaged retirement savings are going to, the sooner you start those, the sooner they will start growing, and the longer they'll have to grow, they will benefit you more in the long term than making payments now towards your student loans. Right? I look at your student loans as, so you took your student loans to pay for your veterinary education, and what you earn as a veterinarian is going to pay back that investment in yourself. Right? So when you start working as a veterinarian, right, you'll be able to contribute a certain portion of your income to pay down your student loans. And your student loans, again, are generally not costly compared to some of the other things that you can do with your resources, right? So starting a retirement account and trying to maximize those, starting if you have access, if you're planning to buy a house or start a family, making sure that you have those things going, and a robust emergency fund equal to 3 to 6 months of your living expenses, right? Other things that might be on the horizon for you to tackle or investigate, depending on what your career plans are after you graduate. Like if you have aspirations of buying or starting your own practice, right? You want to start saving for things like that, because that's going to require cash, right? Your student loans, you'll have plenty of time to pay back your student loans. And because you can peg the payments to your income, how you do will kind of determine how fast they get paid down or whether or not you hit forgiveness. Right? So there's not a huge rush to pay down your student loans, but there is a huge rush if you want to do some of those other things and maximize some of those other financial wellness items sooner rather than later. So I would encourage you to explore those before you accelerate your student loan payoff, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Yep. And especially since you're gonna have access to, like I said, that new version of IBR is crazy beneficial compared to that new repayment option that's coming out online. So you have even more flexibility there if you choose to use it. That's another thing I'll mention. Just from the experiences we see people posting in the boards, you never know where your career is going to take you, right? And for the ones that are kind of like the ones that really tug at the heartstrings are the folks that come out of the gate guns blazing, paying towards their student loans, and all of a sudden they find some dream job that is eligible for public service loan forgiveness, and they can have that balance forgiven tax-free after meeting those requirements. And you can't get that money back that you paid towards your student loans that you didn't need to pay. So just another example of one of the reasons why I'm just not a huge fan of trying to aggressively pay down your student loans. It's just one of the last things on the list of things to do with my money, and particularly when it involves paying more than I have to towards my student loans. And none of you have to pay toward your student loans at all right now, right? Being in school. And then you certainly don't have to pay any more than your income requires you to pay when you do start repayment using an income-driven plan. Any other questions about borrowing or repayment or otherwise? Maybe on any of the tools on the Student Debt Center, or the My Student Loans tool, or the boards, or anything like that?
I have one more question about repayment. They don't talk a lot about when you get to your forgiveness part, like what that looks like as far as how much is taxed and the time you get to pay that.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'll kind of use. Well, let's use this example that we ran through. So I'm going to take this estimate that we generated through the in-school loan estimator, and I'll send it over to the simulator, and I'll show you what this looks like. So they don't talk a lot about that, because the tax that you're going to pay is going to be dependent upon what the tax rates are and how much income you have to show on your tax return that year, which will include the amount that's forgiven. Right? So you can't really give you an exact amount, right? But as you get familiar with filing your taxes, you'll start to understand that when you go to file your taxes every year, you're basically settling up with the government, right? In most cases, if you're an employee and you get paid by an organization or something, you're having taxes taken out of your paycheck. And then when you go to file your taxes at the end of the year, you're calculating, well, how much did I earn? How much did I pay in taxes? And the government's saying, well, how much did you pay? Did you pay too much, or do you still owe us some? And if you paid too much, that's when you get a refund. Right? If you didn't pay enough, that's when you have to pay extra taxes by April 15th of the following year. Right? So when I file my taxes for 2025, I'll do that by April 15th of 2026. if I didn't pay the government enough in taxes based on how much income I showed, then I'll have to pay that additional amount by April 15th of 2026. Right? If you have your loans forgiven in the 2025 tax year, that's going to be treated as income, and you're not going to have paid any tax on that income. Right? So depending on what the government says, okay, based on your tax filing status, how much income you earned, where those income sources came from, the number of dependents you have, this is how much tax you owe on the remaining amount of, quote, income that you haven't paid tax on yet. Right? So that's what's going to determine your tax, and then you will owe that balance by April 15th of that tax year. Right? So ideally, you'll have that amount that you've estimated to cover that tax on hand, so you can write that check to the IRS by April 15th. If you can't, then you'll have to set up a payment plan with the IRS, which will cost you additional interest, fees, late penalties for not being able to pay your taxes on time, right? So you really don't want to be in that position, right? But the good news is forgiveness is not sneaking up on anybody, right? Or not any students anyway, right? So if you're going to have access to the new version of IBR, right, you've got 20 years to plan for this tax, right? So, and that's where the simulator can help, right? So let's use this as an example. We brought over the amount that they borrowed, how much interest, what their weighted average interest rate is. Now we have to enter an income, right? And this depends on what you're going to do after you graduate, whether there's an internship, residency. We'll talk about this more in the Repay Wiser sections, but everybody should file a tax return before they graduate, whether they need to or not, right? So Samantha, I would encourage you to file a tax return before you graduate. And you said you're already married, so you may even consider filing that tax return separately from your spouse, right? Because then you will have the ability to have a minimum monthly payment that's based on your income and not you and your spouse's income, right? So if you do that, then your payment is guaranteed to be zero in the first 12 months after you graduate using a plan like IBR 2014. And let's say that you're going to take a job that pays you $130,000. If you graduate in May, maybe you start that job in June, you're going to have the equivalent of half a year's worth of income on that next tax return. Right? So those first 2 years, you're going to have a very low, if not zero, payment on your student loans, which gives you that opportunity to jumpstart your overall financial wellness. All right, so if I run this simulation, forgot there's a little bug in here when you can't put zero in any of the income inputs right now, but hopefully we'll have that fixed soon. So you'll have access to the new version of IBR if you don't borrow after July 1st of 2026. This will give you an idea of what that payment looks like with this kind of balance, right? So again, I would encourage you to run this for your information. This will show you how much balance is anticipated to be forgiven, right? Now, how much do you going to pay in tax on that? We estimate about 30%. It'll probably be something less than that, but that's going to depend upon how tax rates change over time. But generally speaking, they don't move too much. They go up a little bit, they go down a little bit, but they kind of have stayed the same, at least for the last 40 or 50 years. So we're going to start you off with a 30% estimate. You can certainly put something else in there if you want. Maybe if you think that's too low, you can put it in there. But this gives you an idea of how much your tax would be 20 years from now. And if we want to reach that target, we'll have to allocate about $490 per month in some kind of investment or account that yields at least 4% return per year. Right, and if I do that, my $180,000 tax bill will cost me $118,000, and it reduces my total repayment cost a little bit more just by using time to help me plan for that tax down the road. So again, run this. Go ahead.
For clarification, the taxes that you're paying is like $180,000. What number is the amount that you've already paid up to that point by paying like your lowest, like income driven
So in this table here, in this case, in those 20 years, the total minimum monthly payments you've made based on your income are right here. Right? So if you want to know how much you've paid based on your income along the way, it will show you that in the loan repayment summary table for that particular repayment plan. All right, so in this case, again, this has to do with your income and your family size, but assuming the income projection we used in here over a 20-year period, this person's paid $287,000 in monthly payments over those 240 months. And then they have an additional $180,000 tax at the end, right? But that cost me $118,000, right? So the 118 plus the 287 is what gives me the total that I paid, which includes the tax. And in this simulation, right, we can see that over that 20-year period, even with the taxable amount, it cost me almost $100,000 less than if I tried to pay it back faster over a 10-year period. But that difference is going to depend upon the repayment options you have available and the amount of student debt that you're managing in repayment.
Makes sense. Thank you.
And here's one of the things that, we don't talk about it a ton, but it helps to quantify how much you're actually paying. So most people look at their student loans, and in this case, like a weighted average interest rate of 8.15% may seem like a lot. But the way the income-driven plans work, because it's kind of detached from the amount that you borrowed, and you make payments based on your income instead. In this case, I started with a $327,000 balance that I was paying back at 8.15%. And I end up paying $405,000 over a 20-year period. That means I paid the equivalent of 2.15% per year on my student loans. And this again and run this for your situation, right? This is another reason why I don't want to run to pay back my student loans. I can earn better than 2.15% almost anywhere with my extra money. So again, it doesn't make sense for me to pay extra towards my student loans when it's not requiring a payment, when I can take that extra money, stick it nearly anywhere else and earn a higher return on that. All right, so this is part of what makes your student loans so much more beneficial. Especially when you have access to some of these, unfortunately, expiring repayment options. Right now, we're working on getting this repayment assistance plan in here, and I don't know if this is accurate or not, but you can start to see, the repayment assistance plan is not, even though it ends up with forgiven amount, not nearly as beneficial as some of these other ones. So that's the part that's kind of the kick in the pants. So hopefully this pendulum that's kind of swinging in the wrong direction right now can swing back in the other direction in the future if we allow it to. Any other questions?
Yes, I have one about with the pendulum swinging. Once you have been in one repayment program and then let's say another one becomes available to you and it's more beneficial and you switch over, how does that work in terms of the number of years that you're going to be in repayment? No.
Well, I can only tell you how it's worked in the past and how it's going to work with RAP. So generally speaking, the time that you've spent in previous income-driven plans will count towards the time to forgiveness in another repayment plan. Right? So you don't start the clock over. Consolidation will start the clock over. So again, one of the reasons why we have to be very, very careful if and when we consolidate our loans. However, if I already, if I'm using it's going to be a little bit more difficult to say. I can't think of a reason why anybody would want to do this. However, let's say that you started using IVR and you were using it for 10 years and you wanted to switch to RAP. You can do that, right? And that 10 years that you were in IVR would count towards the 30 years needed to reach forgiveness under RAP, right? That's how it works. However, the new law is a little bit unclear on whether or not if you start with RAP, you can actually switch to a different version of an income-driven plan. And that would only be possible for somebody who doesn't have a loan after July 1st of 2026. So generally speaking, yes, you can move from one plan to another, and that forgiveness time that you've already earned comes with you. However, because we're in the, kind of the wrong direction swing from a borrower standpoint on the repayment options, some of that is becoming more limited. How that is constructed in the future remains to be seen, right? We only know what's written currently, and what has been done in the past, but we're kind of in a, kind of a radical change period right now, right? So we're gonna have to see how this plays out, and then we'll have to see what happens if and when there's a pendulum swing the other direction, and what those changes would allow or not allow. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So we don't, there's not going to be a lot of switching going on for new graduates, right? One, because it's not going to be possible, and two, because you're either going to have access to something that's really beneficial and there'll be no reason for you to switch to something that's less beneficial. And the new grads, right, the ones that are limited to RAP, that's the only option you have, unless or until there's a new version in the future that might be more beneficial. Chances are, though, if they're going to make a more beneficial version, they're not going to make you start repayment from scratch again, right? I mean, that would kind of defeat the point of making a more beneficial plan. So, but we're in the wild speculation area at this point. Any other questions I can not answer with my cloudy crystal ball? Well, cool. Well, thanks for attending, and thanks for allowing me to record this. And we'll put a version of this up on VIN Foundation so your other student colleagues can learn from it. And then I think we're also going to be doing another Borrow Better towards the end of September, October, that we're going to open up to the entire veterinary school student body to encourage them to join and learn from what's changed and how it's going to impact them. Well, good luck getting started with your classes this semester, and thank you all for your help this summer working for VIN. So if you have any questions that come up along the way, please let us know how we can help.
Thank you so much.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you.